Let them join. Let them join later.
Okay. Okay. Good evening, friends. Before we begin, we express our sincere condolence to those who have lost their life during the pandemic. We are also grieving loss of Dr. Balachandran, our dear Balitan. We lost him a few days ago. So it's kind of a grieving period for us. So let's spare a few moments. Okay. So good evening, friends. Today, this is our fourth lecture, a lecture series we have been organizing in order to honor our dear Professor Dr. K.M. Krishnan on his retirement. The last three lectures were in Malayalam, or be precise, the last lecture was kind of bilingual. And this is our first English lecture, and I hope that it won't be a hindering factor for us to actually come and join and respond to the ideas that are being discussed here. I'm so happy to introduce you our speaker, Dr. Rochelle Pinto. Personally, I'm very happy because I had the opportunity to audit one of her courses when I was a student in Delhi University. And she was there in Delhi University. She was one of our beloved professors. And am I audible?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So it's a great honor for me to actually bring her here in Kerala to our gathering. She was kind of an ideal to us because she was one of those professors who were always standing up against the authorities whenever she felt like there was injustice happening. And she was unfortunately one of the teachers who actually left DU during troubling times, or maybe let's say at the beginning of the troubles that have been happening even today. And then she went to CSDS, which was also which where also was also a very inspiring institution, which still is, although as we all know the political situations that have been changing everywhere in India. And today, when she's coming here to deliver a lecture on the legend and the legitimacy of land governance in colonial Goa, I hope that from the abstract that we have been reading for last few days, we have been circulating it among our friends and among various groups. And I hope that even though she may be particularly talking about colonial Goa and the legends and the stories, the narratives that has given legitimacy to the governing system, both by the both to the Portuguese colonialism and maybe to the Brahmanic authoritarianism. There, I really sincerely hope that we can draw parallels, especially when it comes to those legends. At least some of those legends, I think we all share throughout the Konkan region and down south here also. And I'm eagerly waiting for her to begin her lecture in that sense. And it's such a joy to introduce her to Dr. K.M. Krishnan also, because from letters or in letters we have learned how to question everything that is happening around us, which may not necessarily be up to the standards of what is right. And maybe it is where we have learned questioning the injustices that has been happening around us. And so it in a way is a moment where we are bringing two great teachers who are who has been contributing to mold generations after generations to actually to question the unsavory things that has been happening for a long time around us. So in that way also, I'm presenting Dr. Rochelle Pinto to us, and I'm inviting her to the gathering. And ma'am, it's please the floor is all yours. Um,
Thank you. Thank you, Vinny, for a very kind introduction, part of which fortunately I didn't hear since what I heard was too flattering. I'd like to thank the alumni of the School of Letters for this opportunity to participate in your lecture series honoring Dr. K.M. Krishnan. I'd like to thank Vinny for introducing me to what she informs me is a tradition in Kerala universities, and would like to extend my congratulations to Dr. Krishnan. Though we haven't had the opportunity to meet in person, I've been told a lot about the influence on students over the years. So I'm very happy to make this presentation. So in this talk, I examine a settler story about agrarian land in Goa, whose first known appearance in written form was in the 16th century. So the story of how, I'm just going to start sharing my screen. If you just give me a couple of minutes to do that. Just a sec. That's it. Can you see this? Is this, can everyone see the screen?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to. So I examine a settler story about agrarian land in Goa, whose first known appearance was in the 16th century. That's its first known appearance in written form. So the story of how four families settled the land of Goa until it was absorbed into the property of a prince reappeared in many texts, whether official or unofficial, across the centuries. At present, the particulars of the story do not circulate as much as does the idea of original settlers in each village and of original communitarian labor that validates contemporary identity. Not least, the system of land that is said to have emerged from this point, the system of Gaunkari or Comunidad, as it was called in Portuguese, continues to have a legal and economic status in Goa. Historians of law have shown how 19th century colonial powers incorporated local custom to Anglo-French economic and legal philosophies. But I argue that pre-19th century European powers legitimized their presence and extended European legal categories towards the governance of land by merging elements from Christian, classical, and indigenous myths. This created a form of political anthropology, which, as it traveled across texts, that was owned by indigenous groups, whether to assert their rights or to resist the state. It continued to shape the political and literary imagination of 19th century Goa. Its beginning point was the separation of a fragment of a settler myth from its possible Puranic context, and reveals the nature of early modern transformations that came about through colonial rule. And I suspect that this period in history is something that will resonate with the history of Kerala, which is why I thought it might be of interest to the series of talks. Now, in describing the repetition of the settler story and the significance that it acquired as the official myth of the founding of the Gaunkari, the anthropologist Manuel Magalhães highlighted two aspects of its presentation. In official documents, the repetition of the timeless moment when four families settled the land legitimized the process of land settlement by the Portuguese on one hand. On the other hand, in a parallel tradition, Puranas, Mahatmyas, and their offshoots also contain settler accounts that represented and challenged relations between sovereign power, divinity, and the caste privileges of coastal Brahmins, extending from present-day Maharashtra to the region of Kerala and Tamil Nadu, which used to be included those days. These conflicts were in all likelihood aggravated, particularly for the Saraswat Brahmins of the western coast, by the Portuguese transformation of the rural economy from the 16th century onward, which disrupted land and revenue allocations for temples and for ritual purposes. So I'm going to just stop screen sharing for a minute. Yeah, okay. So beyond legitimizing Brahmin settlements and beyond its more recent purpose as a naturalized beginning for a history of land use, the question of the origin of the Gaonkari has acquired other kinds of meanings. Temporal and political patterns from European and indigenous traditions infused it with various connotations that were repurposed and recirculated to meet the epistemological and political demands of each age. In Portuguese texts in particular, ancient and medieval European travel accounts of the region, combined with early modern references, as well as with Puranic temporal schemes. And that's a point that I'd like to emphasize, that it's European texts that actually include indigenous sources as well as European myths. So the use of such cross-cultural references had a political significance, as it made the extension of European legal categories legible and the presence of a European sovereign legitimate. If such narratives worked as political anthropology, by the 19th century, they began to be tested and validated as historical truths and as agrarian policy. So the 19th century history of the reification of the Indian village in British colonial ethnography and among economic philosophers has developed a rich critical history. But what is less known is that European traditions that preceded the late 18th century philosophies about land use have an active history in the Indian subcontinent. In the following section, I briefly indicate a few conceptual categories through which conquered land could be legitimately governed in the Iberian legal context. So the medieval Respublica Christiana considered Islamic land as enemy territory, while any other non-Christian territory could be allocated to a Christian prince. With the division of the realm of the church and state, the new legal titles to land were discovery and occupation. So we know that in the case of Portugal and Spain, we're not talking about the kind of division that occurs in predominantly Protestant nations, but there continued even in the Catholic countries to be a change in the relation between church and state. It wasn't static, even though there was a very strong relationship. Historians emphasize that the status of land governed by the concept of, I quote, occupatio, was in a gray area between natural law and civil law. That is, the period between Vittoria and Grotius, or the 16th to the 19th century. So between theologians like Vittoria, who legitimized the appropriation of conquered land, but insisted on the treatment of non-Christians as legal subjects, and Grotius's secularized conception of political power, which comes later, the legal status of occupied land was uncertain. Or while the concept of imperium established authority at the time of conquest, dominium, or the authority to hold and govern land as property, was unclear. So these are clearly legal distinctions that are being made. This resonates with interpretations of the Portuguese Empire that emphasize the overlapping sources of political and legal authority exercised in the conquests. The historian Giuseppe Marcocci contends that while the arguments of theologians influenced questions of property in the Spanish colonies, it was the papal bulls that were a source of legitimacy for the Portuguese Empire, with institutions like the Mesa de Consciência of 1532, mediating tensions between the crown and the papacy. The terms used in papal bulls, that these are the documents that actually authorize the crown of the crowns of either Spain or Portugal to conduct their conquests. The terms used in papal bulls theologically these conquests also drew on defined traditions of representation. So even if they did not draw on the treatises of theologians like Vittoria, they did draw on defined a schema of representations. And as with occupied land in Latin America, classical and Christian ethnographic conceptions legitimize the merging of European legal traditions with prevailing land practices in Goa. So aside from the shifting relationship between the crown, religious orders, and papacy, it was the circumstances of each conquest that gave rise to forms of anthropologized legality. In particular, it appears as though decisions to recognize or erase indigenous elites and existing agrarian systems were mediated by extending political and legal categories to incorporate new polities. Okay. So these were not always consistent, the way in which new polities were incorporated. A point of difference, for instance, between the consideration of agrarian land as property across Brazil, Algarve in Portugal, and the Indian subcontinent was that India could not be constituted as the new world. So in the image on the left is, I've just have these 2 points which show you Brazil and Algarve, which is within the territory of Portugal. The New World posed a challenge to ancient and Christianized categories that had placed sections of the world deemed to be uninhabited outside the limits of civilization. And India was clearly not positioned in that way. So in response to the conquests, Christian universalism unfolded as a political imperative. And that, I think, is something I'd like to emphasize. So while we're familiar with, looking at the history of Christianity in terms of conversion, I'd also like to talk about how it also introduces a political category. New subjects that entered its grasp encountered its offer of what John Headley terms as its simultaneous open exclusiveness, characterized by the tension between the possibility that all of humanity could be included within the countercurrent of exclusion or erasure of the non-Christian. Other studies suggest that 16th century reports on India were an encounter between new travel narratives and ancient and medieval accounts of the subcontinent that had circulated in Europe. So the otherness of India was not a cosmological shift, even though, as work on the early missionary texts indicate, it was a challenge to the self-conception of Christian Europe. There is no doubt that the practical needs of empire and relative military were retained or dismantled. But as the following discussion indicates, just as with the establishment of Christianity, the administration of agrarian land was mediated by forging a political anthropology that inducted the practices of dominant groups into Portuguese legal practices. At the moment of conquest, agrarian land in the 3 territories of Goa that were initially conquered. So actually in the image on the right, the areas that are highlighted are the first 3 districts, which are called the Old Conquests. And this is really the terrain that the Portuguese held right up to the mid 18th century when it acquired the territories that are lighter, that are in a lighter shade. Okay. Okay, so at the moment of conquest, agrarian land was held by the Bijapur Sultanate, and its acquisition by the Portuguese had 3 characteristics. Okay. So one of these is the erasure of some of the Sultanate's administrative structures, with scarcely a description of their existence beyond the terms and words that evidently had their origin from that period. This was this kind of erasure is characteristic of representations of the Islamic presence from the time of the settling of the Iberian Peninsula in the 12th century by Christian kings. The second is the partial extension of Lusitanized Roman and canon law. Incorporation and often erasure of local conceptions of property and sovereignty and ritual allocations of revenue. This is visible in the Foral of 1526, the first revenue document distributed by the Crown, which was a reorientation of the agrarian world, but not exclusively in European terms. To cite a few examples of the kind of intervention introduced by the Foral, It inserted the crown and to a minor extent the church into the agrarian order, both in administrative and in ritual terms. It recognized a local Hindu ritual linked to the harvest, but only those elements of it that secured the social hierarchy amongst those who held administrative rights. For instance, it allowed honors such as the carrying of the umbrella, the distribution of a rekanat to Gaonkars, even while the practice of allocating land for the upkeep of shrines was disallowed. So though the Foral declared that the crown, the Portuguese crown, only followed what prior rulers had done, intermediaries introduced by the Bijapur administration were in all likelihood derecognized. The Sultanate in neighboring areas had continued to employ Hindus who had the requisite skills and knowledge to maintain land records, even as it altered judicial and revenue structures. The removal of the Desais, who are the revenue chiefs, who installed during the Sultanate in some areas. So their removal was said to be welcomed by the local population. Some of the clauses in the Foral, in fact, explicitly expelled converts to Islam from reclaiming rights in the village communities that I'm discussing, but allowed Hindu Gaonkars who had fled the violence of conquest to retain their rights in that land. So we see that the Foral, though this is very much a Portuguese legal document, it maneuvered between the multiple identities confronting the Portuguese, carving out a new agrarian space by inscribing a Christian harvest ritual among its clauses. So we see that in the single document, you have, sorry, the creation of a kind of rural Christian identity. According to the Foral, the first available written record of the story, to repeat the legend, 4 families migrated from a southern region and began to cultivate the land. And after it had begun to yield and the population increased, a king arrived to assume control, and the settler families began to pay tribute. Now, this retelling did not include the Portuguese, but the local agrarian elite. By suggesting a continuous line of descent from the original cultivators, it enunciated the erasure of any prior order and installed the Portuguese as the latest in the line of sovereigns. Now, when the story was repeated in official contexts in the colonial period and after, it was usually to combat state intervention into the Gaonkari. Thus, 19th century repetitions, for instance, emphasized that the original community of settlers was autonomous of a monarch, and that the institution retained its autonomy over land irrespective of which ruler received tribute. The anthropologist Manuel Magalhães notes that this truncated legend merged the people as a whole with the system of agrarian land administration called the Gaonkari, or comunidade in Portuguese, with the connotation that both had originated, the people and the system had originated at the same moment. Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing for a minute. Yeah. So I'd like to, visit Carl Smith's conception of the idea of nomos because it's useful in this context. As he suggests, I quote, "Nomos is the fundamental process of apportioning space that is essential to every historical epoch." Or, he states, "A new nomos will arise in the perpetually new manifestations of world historical events." The Foral as law and the settler story as narrative lend themselves to being interpreted as nomos, with a claim to be continuing a practice from its moment of its origin, even as a new land-centric order was being inaugurated, and the story of origin was. This brief story appeared again in 2 Portuguese texts after the Foral, and I will be discussing those, after which I might look at indigenous texts that actually lend themselves to these interpretations. So this brief story appeared in 2 Portuguese texts between the 16th and the 18th centuries. And through each repetition in what were canonical and authoritative but not legal texts. While the Foral is a legal document, these were not legal texts. The story acquired different dimensions. The significance of the story lay in its capacity to be narrated as a normative account of original labor that helped to erase signs of violence and to legitimize both colonial and indigenous power structures. Though I'm not suggesting that there's an equal that power is equally shared between the colonial power and indigenous elites. There's no question in retrospect that the indigenous elites were able to intercede in this. Analogies from indigenous and European myths were drawn in to produce a flexible narrative that acquired different dimensions. Retellings both met and countered requirements of scientificity and economic productivity as these arose in the 18th and the 19th century. The indigenous elite and then the non-elite assimilated and represented new knowledge as though it were in continuity with preceding authorities. And this stance, as an epistemological stance, it had precedence in scholastic as well as anti-Reformation intellectual traditions and indigenous ones. So the idea of presenting new knowledge as though it's not a break, but in continuity with preceding authorities. So the settler story provided a model of sovereignty, economy, and sacred geography, which was used to argue the right to retain privileges over land or to challenge them well into the 20th century. The fact that the settler story appeared in official texts lent it historical validity, if not veracity. And this is visible in a significant mid-19th century work, the Bosquejo Histórico das Comunidades, or the Short History of the Comunidades, which I refer to as the BHC because the title is so long. So the BHC, which is a publication of 1852, was a comprehensive compilation of land-related laws and petitions from the 16th to the 19th century that defended the Gaonkari as a traditional land system in Goa, and it was written by a Goan government official, Philippe Néry-Chavier. Through its presentation of the history of land laws and systematic data, the BHC voiced the claims of a group called the Gaonkars, who claimed to have descended from the original settlers. They argued that the system of agrarian production, over which they exclusively held administrative rights, had existed from ancient times. This was not agrarian land in general, and it wasn't private property, but this that governed a section of agrarian land in each village. And this constituted a substantial section of the land in each village in the 16th and the 17th century, but the holdings clearly dwindled as we approached the 20th. To explain its working briefly, let me go back to this. Okay, so to explain its working briefly, the Gaonkari administers sections of cultivable land in each village. It periodically auctioned the rights to cultivation and divided the proceeds as payment to the members of the Gaonkari. The land itself is technically inalienable or cannot be sold, though of course in contemporary times it has been sold. Each Gaonkari had to pay a fixed tribute called foru to the state. Now the term foru derived from the emphyteutic system of land holding, and the Gaonkari system itself had a few similarities with the agrarian structure of emphyteusis. In each village, membership is hereditary. It's based on family lineages called vangods, comprising the male members alone. And while the system was customarily represented as a mini republic, the service providers or the laborers were paid through the Gaonkari, and artisans as well, were paid through the Gaonkari revenues and did not share in the administration. 19th century economic policies favored greater state control to enhance productivity and deter the claim of heredity over administrative posts. And it was in response to this that the Gaonkars mounted a defense emphasizing the antiquity of the Gaonkari's claim to autonomy from the state. Frequently, their defense extended back to the Foral, to the 16th century Foral, as proof of their pre-colonial autonomy. The basic structure of the Gaonkari survived as a result of this massive campaign, though its significance and powers were reduced substantially over the centuries, as also after 1961, when Goa was integrated with India, but it was preserved as an institution and it continues to exist as a legal and economic entity. So the BHC cited two other instances when the settler story appeared in authoritative Portuguese accounts, and which is the reason why they are the focus of this study. One was the Dekadash da Ásia, the canonical 16th century chronicle, whose initial volumes were compiled by João de Barros, who's an official chronicler of the crown. So these texts actually are quite significant when the history of these centuries is written. The other was Padre Francisco de Souza, so this is written by a priest, the Orient Conquistado of 1710, which also became a historical source for the period. In the 19th, the settling of the land continues to be seen as the originary labor that endowed the Gankars with their title, bestowed as recognition from those who had benefited from their enterprise. So we see that the kind of meanings attributed in the Foral in the 16th century itself, those meanings actually carry on and have become commonsensical by the 19th century. Though he implicitly supported the claim of the Gankars, Neri Xavier, the author, did not entirely corroborate those elements that drew on myth and legend, indicating obviously that by the mid-19th century, an event that had occurred in the timeless past was insufficient in the terms of modern history as an account of origin. Now, in the Dekadash, the Asya, whose initial volumes appeared between 1552 and 53, so we're talking about the mid-16th century, the settler story is a mere fragment within an introductory account of the region that is intended to serve as a sort of suitable narrative frame for the arrival of the Portuguese crown with the first governor, Albuquerque's entry into the city. Baruch explicitly suggested that he would have preferred a document or inscription that could testify to the origin of Goa, and it was only in its absence that he had turned to the origin myth as a last resort. However, as the account below indicates, various other symbolic schema were available as plausible and authoritative forms of representation. These served to absorb the region of Goa into a Christian ethnography. So I found it interesting that Baruch specifically says that he would prefer a written document in a 16th century text, but the way in which the narrative is woven together indicates other sources of authority. So Baruch unfolded a historical topography of Goa that describes its primary features with an explanation for the formation of the terrain. Now, this account added a few details to the 1526 version of the Foral. It specifically mentioned that the first groups of settlers had descended from the local hills, which are the Ghats, as they're known in Maharashtra, and named the region, Maharashtra and Goa, obviously, and named the region of Kanara, south of Goa, as the place they had traveled from to make the land arable and fertile, I quote, in the manner of the dikes of Flanders. And as the population grew along with the fruits of the land, his account said, princes and nobles arrived to conquer the poor people. Such was the greed of the cultivators that they sold the inheritance that they and their forefathers had acquired through the sweat of their brow in perpetual contract to lords who emerged from the interior of Kanara and paid them an annual tribute. This settler story occurs in the second volume, of the Dekadash. Now, there are three strands through which Baruch created this narrative. One strand found contemporary political analogies that mirrored on ancient and medieval conceptions of Asia, through which indigenous legends were interpreted. While we use the word narrative for Baruch's chronicle, it is evident that changing epistemological considerations shaped the material he relied on. So the region of Goa was depicted through politically recognizable spaces of cities, islands, streams, rivers, and villages that comprised inhabited space from ancient texts to the early modern. Baruch added a new political space comprising the foot of the Western Ghats, the coast that was recovered from the sea, a geography that he had clearly drawn from indigenous accounts. He says of the actual composition of the coast, and I'm quoting, and what nature produced there, or what was brought there, according to what some say, is churned by giant water snakes. The myth of giant snakes churning the sea is drawn from the Mahabharata. He also accounts for how the western coast as a whole originated, I quote, according to the common opinion of the Genthu, which is the term for Hindu, according to the common opinion of the Genthu of these parts, the coastal strip of Goa had its origin in the local hills, the Ghats, which at the time of creation was erected to withstand the fury of the sea, end quote. So the gravel and deposits found on the shore are formations from ancient times, geological evidence of the effect of the sea on the rock. The claim that the western coast was reclaimed from the sea could have drawn on the legend of Parshuram. Parshuram, an avatar of Vishnu, is said to have avenged his father's murder by killing the Kshatriyas accused of the crime. As an act of atonement, he shot an arrow into the sea, from which point it receded, forming the western coast. In the text that is pivotal to this context, the Sayadri Khand, which is part of the Skanda Purana, Parshuram is said to have brought Brahmin families to the region to settle the land. Many texts have since considered whether geological evidence matches the account of reclaimed land in the legend. Geological details as a feature of cosmology are a common characteristic of Puranas and their accretions. It seems likely that Barush's description was drawn from another text that drew on the same Brahmanical legend, the Grama Padati. The Grama Padati, like the Sayadri Khand, linked a region to the Parshuram legend and was specific to Tulunad, which in contemporary times is associated with the southern districts of Dakshin Kannada, but in the period when the Grampati was written, it extended further up north, but not up to Goa. The description of the coast in the Dekadash was identical to the one quoted by a Portuguese traveler, Duarte Barbosa, in his account of 1516. Barbosa's text may have been Baruch's, though, as B. A. Saletore notes, it was an account of Tulunad. Barbosa mentions the occurrence of fossils and forms of marine life along a hill range that was distant from the coast, suggesting that the sea once covered the raised land. Baruch compared the appearance of the western coast to the miraculous. So apart from this description, which matches a description in the Grama Padati of Tulunad, Baruch also compared the appearance of the western coast to the miraculous survival of pyramids in Egypt, which were overlaid with the dust of Ethiopia, brought from the Nile, or the more recent flash floods of the river Mondego in Portugal. The parallel with ancient topographies draws from a tradition that universalized Greek political concepts by inserting Greek figures into foundational roles in the formation of Indian cities. Rivers such as the Nile characterized the fertility of lands and became an index for civilizations to be ranked according to their processes of productivity and wealth. This was similar to Diodorus's teleological account of civilization in India, moving from hunter-gatherers to scattered village clans and finally cities. So the first groups of settlers, Baruch states, made the lands arable, I quote, in the manner of the dikes of Flanders. The to facilitate agriculture was initiated by the state and the nobility and had become a sign of good governance. Thus, it was still possible to fall back on a form of representation that presented new knowledge by aligning it with existing authoritative accounts. There was no contradiction, therefore, in the continuity of sources and analogies, whether from antiquity or the 13th century. Baruch also described the city of Goa as one situated on an island, adding, I quote, "It is termed an island for no reason other than the fact that it is encircled by two saltwater streams where the sea enters the land." What is implied by the qualification that the island was so called for no reason other than the physical attribute of being encircled by water? A dense medieval symbolism that attached to islands and separated them from terra firma in legends and in papal bulls may have impelled Baruch to indicate that his use of the term did not draw on that tradition. One instance that I could point to is the depiction of numerous islands near the land of Preste João, whose kingdom, it was believed, was a bulwark against the advance of Islam. So Preste João is a legendary figure that was extremely important to the Iberian imagination of the world, and actually that continued to circulate up to the 16th and 17th centuries. So the kingdom was a sort of defense against the advance of Islam and stretched from Ethiopia across India further east. So there was uncertainty about its exact geographical region. Islands in this legend, which was retold from the 12th to the 16th centuries, were places yet to be discovered or were isolated from civilization, or they were spaces of transformation or beings unknown to the mainland. And Baruch had to set aside this pre-existing politico-mythic geography to describe the island of Goa solely through its physical attributes. There is a third strand to Baruch's representation of Goa, which is the renewal and extension of existing symbols. And though the element I'm about to present was not linked to the settler story, it is an important aspect of the range of symbolism through which the subcontinent was made legible outside of missionary texts. So, in the absence of archaeological remains, Baruch narrated the story of a cross that was found in the foundations of a house, a sign that Christianity in India pre-existed the Portuguese. The found cross was said to have been salvaged by Afonso de Albuquerque, who carried it in a procession to a church for its adoration, and then sent it to Dom Manuel, the king. This found cross was interpreted as a sign of the prior presence of the apostle Saint Thomas, who is said to have arrived in India in the 1st century, from which time Christianity took root in southern India. That he had to believe it had happened, and that in the absence of a tangible symbol, he saw in the found cross, I quote, the new light of faith. Just as the Foral had legitimized the economic intervention of the Portuguese by claiming that they had merely demanded the same tribute as earlier rulers, the found cross and its consecration by Albuquerque absorbed the arrival of a new Christian power into an already existing Christian tradition. Legends attaching to Saint Thomas emerged not only from within the Indian Christian tradition, but had circulated in Europe prior to the 12th century letter of Prestijuan, the legend I'd referred to earlier. A discussion of the story of Prestijuan points to the homologous relation with Saint Thomas and suggests that both myths had a politico-theological significance that united the East and the West. So the reason why I presented this was to emphasize that India as a land was prefigured not just in travel accounts or in ancient travel accounts, but within specifically Christian literature. And the discovery of a cross renewed a symbolic tradition that could acquire new dimensions in the future. Though the found cross does not concern the origin of cultivation, it indicates the available symbolic schema through which a past shared by the West and the East could prepare the terrain of India to be inscribed by signs that legitimized the Portuguese presence. I'm just going to, right. So to switch a little, the manner in which, while this concerns, Christian and European symbols, the manner in which dominant Hindu cosmologies from the Mahabharata or the Sayadri Khand were absorbed into Baruch's description suggests that the cultural newness of the conquests could be delimited by extending the symbolic capacity of existing frameworks. While the inclusion of Hindu cosmologies admitted only as much difference as could be accommodated to classical or primitive Christian frameworks, it reveals a strategy of symbolic synthesis that became a composite intellectual pattern employed in official and dissenting representation. So actually one of the points that I wanted to emphasize was that this is something that actually begins to be owned as a tradition by both the indigenous elite and then, in order to contest the state, by non-elites as well. Right. So I also think it's important, while we're tracing the history, not to continue, after 4 centuries of the Portuguese presence, to see the emergence of this, what is really a combined tradition and discourse, as exclusively colonial. There is no doubt that by the 16th century, many myths and concepts, including that of Prestijuan, were limited to their historical dimensions. Asia. However, political geographies continued to be significant as models that combined concepts of sovereignty and sacred geography. If by including the origin story, the Foral had given it an anthropo-legal status, the Dekadash had juxtaposed the same story with Christian and classical accounts of Asia. Combined with recent examples of agrarian governance, this infused the terrain of Goa with historical and mythic symbols, anchoring it to a past and a present that linked Europeans and Indians, while sustaining a model of sovereignty that was legible to European readers. So I'd like to move on now to the second account of the origin story, and I'm just going to go back to the slides for that. Okay, so the second account of the origin story is from the Orient Conquistado, a chronicle written by a Luso-Brazilian priest, Padre Francisco, a Jesuit priest, Padre Francisco de Souza, and published in 1710. As is evident from the complete title, which you can see from the image, it was a Christian apologist account in which the horizon of action and agency was determined by the expansion of populations and territories that could be called Christian and by the working of faith. It narrated events across 20-year segments from about 1542 to 1610. So in itself, it actually became quite an important source of history. So just as Baruch sought an appropriate narrative inauguration for Albuquerque's entry, the settler story in the Orient Conquistado provided preliminary context for representation of St. Francis Xavier. I'm just going to stop there. St. Francis Xavier, as is well known, is a very significant saint among Catholics in Goa. And the event that he narrates is in fact located and is about the transformation of the southern district of Salsette in 1560. So in comparison to João de Barros, the Orient Conquistado offered a slightly different model of sovereignty. And two elements in particular stand out as different from Baros's account. And you have to remember also so interestingly, while this is a text of the 18th century, the fact that it's written as a Christian apology, right? And it's a text that's driven primarily by faith and religious symbolism, we see that the question of historical validity still hasn't really emerged. So the two elements that stand out as different, the first is that it is the king who introduces the fundamental structure of the Gaonkari to ensure a form of social organization that will guarantee the payment. Version insists repeatedly on the absolute autonomy of the Gaonkars over the internal running of the organization. So the text states that as productivity increased, a king descended from the Ghats, assumed power without war, and bought the land, as did Joseph in Egypt, and offered it back to the cultivators in a perpetual contract for a fixed tribute, irrespective of the magnitude of the yield. The payment to the king is thus the first moment of alienation of labor and political power. In order to be able to collect this foru, the account states, the king divided the land into villages and the villages into lineages, each of which had to pay the foru. And the descendants of these, the narrative says, are called Gaonkars. So it repeats it and it affirms that the Gaonkars, in fact, have inherited this right. Now, the OC's analogy between Joseph in Egypt and the non-violent arrival of a king drew on the book of Genesis, which contained an account of how Joseph had enslaved to Pharaoh the entire non-clerical population of famine-ravaged Egypt. Both stories legitimize links between agriculture, divinity, and sovereignty. To summarize aspects that are relevant to the Gaonkari story, Joseph had the foresight to save grain over several harvests in a time of plenty, but when these were exhausted during a famine, on behalf of the Pharaoh, he gained control of agricultural land in Egypt and over its owners as slave labor in exchange for the assurance of food and the distribution of seed that would secure their future. So the land that was secured was cultivated, after all, by its former owners by paying a fifth of the income to the Pharaoh. Now, the Egyptian king's assumption of control through an administrator provided an ancient precedent in which the domination of formerly free owners resulted eventually in productivity. The idea of benevolent domination, of the transition from free possession to subjugation, and the ambiguity over the cultivators and their volition are elements that this narrative shares with the settler story in the Foral and in Baruch's Dekadash. The story of Joseph had acquired iconic value as a narrative about administration and despotic rule. So Hugo Grotius's play, Sophompaneish of 1635, rationalized Joseph's interventions by attributing administrative roles to him. And between the 17th and the 19th century, the story continued to be cited to depict tax regimes as a sign of good governance. In the 18th century, for instance, an issue of the Parliamentary History of England inserted the story of Joseph into its overarching assessment of tax regimes, culminating with the presence of the British in India as a reformist and biblical account of an agrarian crisis the Joseph story suggests a model of legitimate economic practice for the church, both in the context of the Indian subcontinent and the wider economic culture of Catholicism in Europe, in which the question of what constituted legitimate financial activity for the church was an active one. It's possible that the local source for the settler story in the Orient Conquistado as well was the Grama Padati, in most versions of which it is the Kadamba king Mayur Varman, who, following on the creation of the territory by Parshuram, acts as an intermediary to bestow the territory on Brahmin villages. Further, in the Grama Padati too, and as the Orient Conquistado suggests, divisions of land, households, and caste groups are defined by Mayur Varman, unlike the version in the Foral, where social organization is organic and precedes the arrival of the king. Now, in contrast to this realm of Portuguese official print that he states enjoys exaggerated significance, the anthropologist Manuel Magalhães gestures to an agrarian economy that was more responsive to shifts in the linked realms of caste status and economic fortune prior to the arrival of the Portuguese. The uniform apportioning of proceeds across Gaonkaris may have been introduced with colonial intervention, he suggests. In particular, the curtailing and abolishing of ritual expenses reduced the redistributive function that the Gaonkari shared with the sovereign. The settler story itself is so generic that it could have arisen in many parts of the world. In India, the reiteration of the antiquity of one's lineage as a claim on land usage can be found in Punjab as much as in Kerala or other parts of South India. There are, however, two other kinds of narratives that are particular to the southwest coast of India, against which the settler account can be juxtaposed. And in the following section, I'm going to try and just pick up elements of these texts and these practices that we could see as a parallel for Goa. So each village in Goa, as Magalhães and others indicate, could have an origin myth, which involved a human figure, the Gram Purush, and the village deity, the Gram Devta. These stories were detailed, they differed from one another, and they often concerned, but they weren't centrally concerned, with how cultivation began, or the village was founded through the intervention of both the deity and the Gram Purush. Now, this official myth about four families settling the land cannot be read as a detail of the more localized story of the Gram Purush, because usually the spatial reach of the village origin stories would not extend beyond the boundaries of the village, whereas the settler story is clearly a pan-regional one. Right. Okay. So aside from these individual origin stories, the pan-regional legend about the Saraswat Brahmins had acquired prominence across the western coast, where the community resided. The story recurs in texts produced in the southwestern regions of Tulunad, South Kannada, and Kerala. For the Saraswat Brahmins whose status was challenged across the coast across these centuries, it provided a lineage that helped consolidate their position in relation to other groups, particularly in the case of Maharashtra, in relation to the Chitpavan Brahmins. And it became a symbol of intra-Brahmin conflict in Western India. The Gaonkari is not an exclusively Brahminical or upper caste organization, though upper castes are dominant if we consider the former old conquest districts alone. The Sayadri Khand, the text in which the Parshuram legend appears, is not primarily about land. So it was the repetition of the legend in official texts that linked it to the origin of agrarian organization, as though that was its primary function. The Grama Padati associated with Brahmin families in the region of Tulunad, and as is well known, Salatore has done a sort of extensive study on it. It's associated with Brahmin families in the region of Tulunad in the southwest, and it claimed to be a part of the Sayadri Khand as it drew on the Parshuram myth to legitimize Brahmin families of South Kannada. Its narrative, said to be composed after the 14th century, differed from that of the Sayadri Khand, both in terms of the Parshuram story and the forms of property inheritance that it detailed. So texts like the Sayadri Khand and the Grama Padati embedded community histories within lineages of monarchs and divinities, as well as attributes indicating the geographical, ritual, and jurisdictional limits of each of various communities, which were features associated with Puranic texts. The legitimacy of a community's claim on land or on caste honors drew on legends in which they had been conferred grants by legendary kings or divinities, and the historical validity of the king's reign or the event was not paramount. The question of land as a right or an inheritance could not be separated, therefore, from the linked issue of caste status lineage and the jurisdictional powers of the community. The prevailing conceptions of agrarian land were therefore not a symmetrical parallel to those introduced by the Portuguese, whether one considers the enforceability or compulsion implied in the texts or the legal status of the land claimants. For instance, in the several versions of the Grama Padati, it is the king Mayurvarman who intercedes as the sovereign to bestow land on Brahmin communities, but the same legend could in some cases with variable property arrangements, such as Bhutala Pandya, said to be Mayurvarman's nephew, which is mentioned by Salatore, who is said to have introduced matrilineal inheritance or the Alya Santana to Tulunad. The Alya Santana is a matrilineal form of inheritance. So such texts relied on their narrative authority to claim rights deriving from a relationship to the sovereign and a socially hierarchized relationship to other castes in a spatially defined region. As a form of socio-religious authority, they could support or counter claims on land, but in themselves they did not constitute law. As written texts, Rosalind O'Hanlon asserts, Puranas acquired, I quote, an expanded social and judicial role in the early modern era, becoming in the process effective platforms both for the histories of the mobile and the identities of the settled. O'Hanlon notes that the territories associated with Parshuram, which is termed as Parshuram Kshetra, extended across Karnataka, Kerala, and the Tamil region, with similar narratives binding settlements of communities with the myth. So we're also looking at a continuity of texts that parallels the Portuguese texts that I talked about, but of course they're completely different in their dynamic. An account of the gradual Brahmanization of the dynastic tradition in Kerala traces several texts that incorporated elements of the legend, so that by the 12th century, the geographical territory implied in the Parshuram story included Kerala. So S.H. Levitt and Rosalind O'Hanlon argue that sections of the Sayadri Khand that identify Brahmins according to their language region are associated with the 13th or the 14th centuries. In relation to the Grama Padati, the historian Nagendra Rao says that it incorporated 18th century usages and changes to the status of some of the central Brahmin families with which it was concerned. So we also see the manner in which these texts actually transform themselves across time and in relation to these events. Further, Rao's discussion of the Grama Padati in conjunction with the Sayadri Khand reveals how caste claims were challenged by incorporating and retelling the Parshuram myth, or by aligning a community with the history of another sovereign or divinity. In order to demonstrate its authenticity as a part of the Puranic tradition, he says, the Grama Padati claimed to be part of the Sayadri Khand. Now, while a central tenet of Saraswat identity formation is the claim of migration from Bengal, at least in Goa, historical responses, with some exceptions, tend to corroborate migration from different areas north of the Konkan. S.H. Levitt, for instance, affirmed that Mayurvarman had brought Brahmin families from Ahichatra in northern India, establishing 32 villages in South Kannada, for which he says there while another settlement of Brahmins from Ballabi in Saurashtra to Goa is said to be from an earlier time, though both migrations, he says, occurred in the 10th century. So a majority of Gaonkars, as stated earlier, were not Brahmin, however. A reminder that either this pattern of Brahmin settlements had been extended by the Portuguese to the region as a whole, or the Brahmin element, the Brahmin legend had hegemonized official representations. So while D.D. Kosambi, for instance, suggests historical references for Brahmin migration, he notes that the Gaonkari form of landholding could only arise when new terrain was being settled for cultivation. And he asks, when did this almost unique form of pioneer enterprise originate? In terms of a historical study, therefore, the question of origin of caste identity in the legend and the possible caste composition and structure of the Gaonkari are separate questions. It is likely that the inalienability of land, which is a distinctive feature of the Gaonkari in Goa, may have been introduced by the Portuguese as an element of the emphiteutic or the system of emphiteusis, the emphiteutic contract, and combined with some elements from local systems. There are also instances across the western coast when land was held in a corporatist manner as villages in their entirety, predominantly as a result of grants to Brahmins. Keshavan Veluthat's study of Brahmin settlements in South Kannada and Kerala offer various points that are at least parallels or points of comparison. He notes that in the later Hoysala period, the 12th to the 14th century, inscriptions mention a corporate agrarian body called the Elame or Elame Galu, which may have been equivalent to the Perila Mayor or non-Brahmin peasants of Tamil Nadu, as he suggests. This would imply, he argues, that while non-Brahmin peasant proprietors were influential in an earlier period, perhaps they formed corporate bodies and acquired state recognition around the time of the beginning of Vijayanagar rule. So this offers us a possible parallel for the existence of non-Brahmin Gaonkaris. Veluthat also offers a theory of state that could address the claim to autonomous administration that the Gaonkars of Goa argued for right across the centuries. This claim was usually challenged by Portuguese officials who customarily interpreted this conflict over the autonomy of the Gaonkars against the state through emphiteutic titles such as Senhorio Util, which implied usufructory right or the right to the fruits of the land, or Senhoro Direto, which is an ownership right, which is what the Gaonkars claimed that they had. Veluthat notes that in the records of the representative body of villages of South Kannada, called the Nadu, the names for chiefs from the 12th century on were replaced by those of the agents of the Hoysala and Vijay. Hoysalas, local chiefs comprised the unit that represented these corporatist agrarian structures. I quote from Veluthat's text, "The problem does not appear to be as simple as the replacement of a name by another name or an office by another office," he says, "but a sign of the establishment of the state in a firm manner in South Kannada, indicating a major political change in this region." Now, though the region of Goa is not obviously the focus of Veluthat's analysis, it had a similar relation to regional kingdoms, and there are studies of a prior time and of inscriptions under the Bhojas, which also give us examples of corporatist villages. It is possible that the claim to autonomy in the settler story referred to a time when a central administrative authority was absent. Another possible parallel for the decision-making powers of the Gaonkars is Veluthat's observation that following the disintegration of the Chera kingdom after the 12th century, there were no representatives of central authority in the Brahmin Sabhas. These settlements therefore grew more powerful and autonomous with no quorum required, and with family members or proxies standing in for absent members. Other parallels that we can think of are the Desa, the Gota, all of which draw from pre-Sultanate practices and were transformed into a right that was exercised by a collective rather than an individual under different rulers. So the Desas, the General Assembly, or the Gota existed in territories in the west and the south of India and pre-existed the Portuguese. All of these are sort of village assemblies and decision-making bodies. Discussions of land and political power anchored by caste identity circulated in a somewhat autonomous sphere, as they appeared in texts and practices in Sanskrit, Marathi, Kannada, and Malayalam. Official interventions in land, temple management, and ritual practice ensured, however, that they were reinscribed through the conceptions of politics, legitimacy, and veracity inherent in the Portuguese political sphere. Further, Jesuits recorded as well as composed in the Puranic tradition, recuperating what they knew of ancient texts of the region. Thus, while we can see distinct modes of representation that divided the sphere of Portuguese and Marathi literati and officialdom, a mutually legible discourse was also being forged through religious texts. Initially driven by missionary perspectives, this was disruptive, but also productive of new discourses and meanings that found their way into political representations to both the church and the state. The authority of the canonical Portuguese text discussed earlier was subsequently strategically appropriated by indigenous elites in the 19th century to resist rationalist interventions by the state and to overturn old hierarchies. Concluding section of my paper. And I go back to Carl Schmitt, who, though he enjoys, heroic beginnings for the beginning of civilization, he observes that the conquest of land and the law that governs it do not occur simultaneously, as the latter legitimizes the former. I quote, "Land appropriation precedes the order that follows from it." Though not necessarily cognizant of the erasure of a prior order, his pronouncements foreground the possibility that each narrative of origin and newness, whether in the clauses of the Foral or the settler story, is a claim to hegemony, a fulfillment of his prognosis that a new nomos will arise in the perpetually new manifestations of world historical events. And when he says nomos is the fundamental process of apportioning space that is essential to every historical epoch. Now, these statements illuminate the potential of narratives that could incorporate conquests into Christian genealogies, thereby legitimizing the Portuguese presence. Baruch's weave of analogies, for instance, relied on his readers' recognition of symbols and syntax of biblical cosmogonies. The fact that it drew from European and indigenous narratives explains its resilience when it appeared in discourses of both domination and resistance, and persisted in the literary and political imagination of land in Goa over the centuries. Many accounts of 18th and 19th century British colonial land policies trace how notions of indigenous customs were selectively incorporated into Anglo-French law. The study of Iberian powers, however, are a reminder that until the 17th century development of natural law, biblical genealogies had a politico-legal dimension. The Papal Bull of 1493 specified that conquering powers had rights only over lands that were not already effectively the possession of a Christian sovereign. And though this was a mere detail, it had the potential to constrain the exercise of power if raised by any other contender to the same conquests. And in order to contend with both the papacy and many of the conquistadors, the Spanish crown found a means to stake an independent claim by inserting Iberian monarchs into the lineage of Noah, which drew the 15th century conquests into the partitioning of the earth among Noah's sons. The fact that such claims, revisiting the genealogies of Noah's sons and laying a claim sometimes to a genealogy that preceded the papal bull, the fact that these were made by the British, the French, and the Dutch into the 17th century indicates that this was not merely an Iberian political strategy. So, though the Indian subcontinent was not designated as an anthropo-political method, lent itself to narratives that could be pieced together from old and new sources. What is of interest to the history of the Comunidad are the ways in which the rhetoric of timeless origin and continuity was kept alive, not just as affect and public memory, but in official petitions and representations that resisted the separation of economic questions from ethics, custom, and right, which assured continuity of status. The separation of the story of the coast recovered from the sea from its source, whether the Gramapadati, the Sayadri Khand, or the Mahabharat, enabled its appearance in official writing. While the rhetoric of continuity undoubtedly formed part of a conservative anti-enlightenment stance to contest the legitimacy of the idea of political economy, it also persists today as a shared belief that has some legitimate uses in the present to form solidarities that challenge the usurping of land in Goa by neoliberal formations. And I'd like to end there. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you,
Yeah.
Rochelle ma'am, for this wonderful paper. Actually, after
Sorry if it
listening to
continued
you,
for too long. Yeah.
no, it's okay, ma'am. No, you haven't. It was really interesting, and it kind of remind us that we need to read more. It was a very analytical paper in the sense that we need to know the backstories and legends of so many things, and also the we should have a historical sense of what has been transferring in these lands that you have discussed. Then only we will be able to completely comprehend the depth of what you have just said. Even though we could all show solidarity to the effort that has been taken place, even with the help of these shared cultural narratives to challenge the um, neoliberal movements, even though we're not sure how effective it could be. But anyway, thank you so much for this presentation. It was deeply analytical, and we hope that it helps us all in understanding, or at least helps us all having glimpses of what had transferred, especially before the British colonial period in Goa, between the indigenous and the Portuguese traditions. Um, Now, as tradition proceeds, I invite Dr. Krishnan to respond to Dr. Pinto. We will begin our discussion session by.
Yeah, thank you, Vinny, and thank you, Dr. Rochelle Pinto, for this wonderful presentation. So rich in detail. And we, as people from the Faculty of Language and Literature, but still, I thought that even though as far as methodology is concerned, there are definitely differences in the richness of the details and erudition as well. There was something for those who are interested in narratives. There was something for those who are interested in social hierarchies. There was something for those interested in several other aspects of social formation. And all. So the point that I probably wanted to ask is, or the way I would like to react to your presentation is by asking whether the narratives, or maybe the politics of narrative, as we can probably call it, uh, also went a long way in, at one level, of course, legitimizing the existing hierarchies of power, uh, and also landholding as well, and as in the case of the specific issues that you mentioned. It also probably helped erase uh, the contingent nature or the historical nature of the social formation. That is probably something that I would like you to react to. One. And secondly, how do these in a way relate to the rest of India? In fact, you have confined yourself to Goa and the southern parts of India. And how do they that way relate to the other parts of India? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Krishnan. Vinny, would you like me to respond right away, or should I?
Maybe we can wait for the responses from others as well.
Okay.
So now
just a minute, this is Farina, and I'd just like to also respond along with Krishna. I'm from Tejpur University, Dr. Pinto. Did the Portuguese narrative change over time? It started, as you say, maybe in the 16th or 15th century. And then gradually, did it change? You said that there were parallels between indigenous narratives and the master narrative begun by the Portuguese, inserting God and Christianity there. Did governance and other hegemonic issues creep into it? That's it. Thank you.
Should I reply, Vinny?
Let's wait for other questions first.
Okay, sure.
If it is okay.
So you tell me. Okay.
Okay. Uh, I think actually it's heavily raining in various places.
Okay.
So I hope that everybody would respond without much delay, so that
okay. I'm sorry.
more
I
people
was
can
sharing the
actually
slides,
listen
so I
to
didn't
us.
see. Yeah, I see there are messages saying that I wasn't audible.
No,
I'm sorry if the talk got.
Actually, ma'am, I think most of us were able to listen to you.
Okay.
There are a few, yeah, it was a bit difficult. I think it was the range issue. Yeah, and
Okay.
also
Okay.
contributing factor, raining.
Yeah. Sorry about that because I had the
Dr. V.
slides in
Hariharan
front of
sir
me.
is here.
Okay.
Okay. Dr. Saji Matthew is here. Dr. Hariharan is here. And so many other scholars who are coming from various universities. I request all of you to respond or ask questions, clarification, etc. so that we can make this session more.
This
May I
is
ask-
Hariharan from Kerala University. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Well, I was the one who typed in because I
Right,
missed
yeah.
out a few things in the
I'm
initial
sorry.
part.
Right.
No, that's
Sorry.
fine. But I was particularly fascinated by the way in which you have all these narratives which created different spaces which were power systems in themselves in certain ways. So that I thought was very, very fascinating. And I was also thinking of how, let's say, Europe generally did go out and tried and settled other parts of the world. So I was kind of thinking of how, or was there a pattern in, let us say, the way in which they settled, let's say, in the United States or perhaps in Latin America, right? The Spaniards coming to Latin America, and then the way in which they try to settle down in a way in Goa. But then, very interestingly, the British, for example, never did settle down in the way in which we use settle down. So I was really wondering how exactly do we, as uh, researchers involved in social sciences and humanities, how is it that we can tease out these differences? So this is what I was thinking as I listened to you, because I've been struck by the way in which the British, for example, came here and had this kind of a very interesting engagement. But then it was so different, for example, when they went to, let's say, Australia or Canada. But then yeah, right. So this is the way in which I would like to respond to your presentation. Thank you.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I just actually just want a little clarification. It was such a dense and fine talk. I don't know where to even begin, but thank you so much.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I should learn
No,
to present, better. Just leave out stuff, but
no. I wouldn't want you to leave out a single detail. It was just really, really rich. I'm still processing. But I just wanted a clarification about something, maybe elaboration of something that you said right at the end, which is something that I find myself personally interested in, which is this contrast that you said a lot basically, but right at the end of a contrast between a more mythic imagination of land colonization and land settlement and a more political economy understanding, which is maybe to do with more directly with an extractive logic, which asks citizens in a modern form of conservatism to be grateful to the sovereign, right? So you have the community held, not community held, but community passed on semi-mythic traditions which the Portuguese appropriated, right? And then you have, and I'm putting it really, really quite crudely in a binary, but I thought that there was something really suggestive about what you said right at the end, Rochelle, about this contrast and how the earlier or more mythic understanding becomes a resource, a political resource in recent mobilizations against neoliberal takeover of land and the new logic of accumulation that is very clearly visible in Goa. So I was, my little clarification was, could you say more on that? Like, did I get that right? And a tiny little provocation, which is that even within the political economy school, aren't there somewhat mythic elements like, if you read Adam Smith right now, for instance, so the old political economy blends these very commonsensical community notions about value, right, in a way that the modern late 19th century Marxist political economy doesn't. So that whole extraction is based in not community notions, but it is based in some kind of invocation of the supra-physical in the old political economy. So I'm just saying, if I got your distinction right, then my provocation follows. But if I didn't get it right at all, which is a possibility, then yeah, I have only a clarification. I don't know if that made sense. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah.
Excuse me if I'm asking a wrong or maybe a stupid kind of question. But I was wondering, in which language were these narratives circulated?
Yeah. Okay. Vinny, maybe I should reply before everyone leaves.
Okay, please, sir. One second. If anybody wants to ask any more questions, if so, please, you can write it down there also, chat box. It's okay, ma'am, right?
Yeah.
They can also write it down so that we can save time. Okay. So please.
Yeah. So thank you for, these hugely crucial questions, which I should, begin to think about when I'm working further. I'll address Dr. Krishnan's questions first. So I'll address the simple one first, which is the Portuguese texts are obviously sort of in Portuguese, but while some of the Sayadri Khan, for instance, exists in Sanskrit, there are also variations on it, and those would have been, they would be reprinted in Marathi, for instance, and that reprinting and circulating, as we know, creates its own kind of history. So these texts would appear in Sanskrit, in the grammar Padhati, in Tuluva, in Kannada, and Marathi, other languages. So I obviously have not read.
Not Konkani.
So interestingly, Konkani remains a sort of oral. It remains an oral language until the Jesuits then begin composing in it. So when I said actually that the Jesuits composed in the Puranic tradition, though they composed the Krista Purana, which is the earliest in Marathi. So there's also a distinct way in which they employed Konkani and Portuguese. They composed other texts in Konkani, but the Krista Purana was in Marathi. And then you have subsequent compositions in Konkani. But the Sayadri Khand, etc., that also tells us something about the nature of ritual practice in Goa. You're perfectly right about it, about the Portuguese erasing the contingent nature of the economy, and also possibly of perhaps of caste structure. Though if we're looking across the centuries, we can see plenty of contestation happening. But the use of emphasis and these conceptions of sort of Roman land tenure concepts do actually bring a kind of fixity to, I think, to land governance. And that's something that the anthropologists have been reading also suggests that, so even though there's a contention that the Portuguese did not change very much because they were here in the 16th century, they didn't have the kind of military strength to carry out the sort of survey or the manpower to carry out the kind of survey that the British did. The argument, therefore, is that even in the kinds of little land partitions that we see, it's obvious that local traditions continue. My argument is to say that you can very clearly see these legal traditions, and we have to account for all the kinds of meanings that that we draw from the appearance of words like foru and aframentu, which continue in Goa to the present day in the Comunidad system. When you say how do they relate to other parts of India, for me, the interesting the way in which I tend to approach it from the perspective of this project is to try and examine when it is that the idea of the village republic emerges. And I suspect, particularly in the work of Baden-Powell, that perhaps the villages of Goa begin to be a model. And when I say villages of Goa, representations of the villages of Goa as institutions that embody self-care and that have a permanence and have a timelessness, it's possible that they were seen as instances of the ideal village republic. And the fact that the foral is picked up as historical evidence, not as a sort of construction or a kind of reinvention of two traditions, but it's often been seen as historical evidence of the existence of the Gankari. So that in a way helps to and the fact that the Portuguese use Roman law, Roman tenurial terms, I think reinforce the idea of the idea that India is somehow an embodiment of ancient village practices or an ancient village model. But that actual connection is something I have still to trace from text to text in the 19th century. So that's the way in which, so interestingly, what happens actually after this mid-19th century moment is that Portuguese and Goan historians begin to turn to British ethnography, and they start corroborating what is in fact a prior history with ethnographies that are emerging from Madras and from Calcutta, but initially India. So often even their footnotes for the Parshuram legend, etc., they'll sometimes draw on the early British ethnographers who picked it up in Kerala and in regions of Tamil Nadu. So there's no point at which I can pick up a set of texts and see them as simply reflecting history. Each of them are actually working through epistemological questions. And thank you, Farina, for your question. The Portuguese narrative did change over time. So while I've been emphasizing the way in which they continue to rely on mythic elements, by the end of the 18th century, you can very clearly see a kind of discourse of productivity that enters. And so there are various, Vinny, when she invited me, was talking about how modernity was of interest in general as a question. So for me, the separation of the myth from what we might call its religious or scriptural sort of Puranic kind of context is in a way one step towards, a sort of early modern practice. But in the 18th century, there's almost a violent sort of rejection of the church in Portugal. And there's a kind of, there's an incorporation of new Enlightenment philosophies by fiat. So it's almost like a sort of dictatorial imposition and pushing away of the church. And that's where you have, as state policy, you have the narrative changing. And you have all kinds of, so all the laws that changed in the 19th century are a result of that changed impetus by the state. I'd like to thank Professor Hariharan for these very crucial questions. So I should actually be looking at Australia and Canada, but I have also been trying to look at parallels between the way Brazil, and the reason I mentioned Algarve is that there are these territories that are part of Portugal that are actually considered as their first colonies. So, it takes us back to the word colonos, which is always about settling the territory as much as it was about conquest. And so the interesting thing about all these territories is it depends on what you're looking at. So I found that the foral was distributed from the 12th century on, when the Portuguese were settling the land after they defeated the Umayyads. They defeated a variety of sort of Islamic powers who were in the Iberian Peninsula. The foral was a means of resettling, of settling the land, not resettling. And it was reissued in the 16th century, right, by Dom Manuel. And at that point, it was a kind of assertion of absolutism. But in the colonies, it gets distributed, but the terms are a little different. So, which is why for me, it was of interest that in Brazil, for instance, the indigenous are not supposed to trade. Whereas in Goa, in comparison, there's extraordinary recognition of there's a way in which the terrain itself is reinscribed, right? Because these turn into plantation economies. So it's almost, there's a kind of, ecopoetics and actually find Rajan Gurukul, portions of Rajan Gurukul's work, lend themselves to this kind of interpretation, where he talks about, I think he's talking about the Tinai in Tamil Nadu, and he's talking about geopoetics in Sangam poetry as a way of conceptualizing the terrain, which is also in a way a recognition of power. And I think the Foral begins to do this, where you have what seems to be a uniform legal vocabulary, but the relationship with the inhabitants and the nature of the terrain is actually slightly different. So the relationship with other settler powers, I think there's a tendency that I have perhaps to overstate the difference, which I think links it to Sonalini's remark as well. So I'm not really separating the mythic and the mythic and the rationalist when I talk about the Portuguese and the British. I'm really responding to a tendency to focus only on the 18th and 19th century, at which point what we see is a sort of incorporation of custom into what we recognize as economic philosophy that's been separated from the ritual. Whereas in the case of, say, the 16th and century narratives that I see, it's not as though, so the reason why I kept emphasizing that Baruch would also prefer a written document is to say that we can see that as early as the 16th century, the need for something that's historically a little different. But it's to state that genealogy and myth have a political function. And that remains significant. I know that the question of Noah's genealogies actually carry on even in British writing with Blackstone, etc. They're there as motifs, but there's a push away from that kind of writing. But I sort of take your point about not overstating not overstating the two. So yes, there is a way in which we can see all like economic philosophy as a secularization of various concepts, and from the time that we have positive law, that is what's happening. Various ways in which to push away both initially the king and then the church from the realm of law. So yes, I'm not asserting a sort of absolute separation, but it's of interest to me to talk about how European powers, the self-conception is invested in biblical genealogies as well. Right. So to sort of just talk about the contemporary, it's the Comunidad has different roles in the contemporary. So you will find articles, for instance, which talk about how it's upholding the rights of upper castes over other caste claimants on land and on the temple. The claim on being the original settlers is, very obviously has two kinds of implications. On the one hand, there is a xenophobic implication which has been very explicitly voiced in Goa against various kinds of migration, which is to say we are the originals and everyone who's come after us are outsiders. And this kind of narrative lends itself very strongly and lends historical validity to that kind of claim. But the other is the fact that the Comunidad is technically inalienable, even though it has been sold now for decades and decades. But the fact that the land, there is a kind of legal resource that you could tap into also means that, these are vocabularies that we are free to interpret in the present, irrespective of what their history may have been. So yeah, I think in terms of my response, I'll stop there. I'm happy to take more questions.
I just want to respond to say that totally clarifies it, and that's a good point about the new economic philosophies from Adam Smith onwards, replacing far less secularized kind of realm where there was less. I mean, basically, sorry.
Is there any?
No, I'm just saying.
Good point. Audience, feel free to ask. The reason why people are forced to leave is actually, because of the rain.
Okay.
And if you are.
Things are getting cut off.
Okay.
Hello?
Yeah. Sonalini, are you there?
Okay, there is something wrong with
I'm very much
the
here, but I
network.
was wondering if there were other questions. Mine was just.
I'm not sure if people can connect actually.
There are 21 people.
I think, yeah, I think that's gonna, no. Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yeah.
Can I just add one more little thing?
Yeah, I can hear you. I'm extremely sorry. My connection
Isn't great. Maybe if someone else can just sort of
had some
monitor it.
issues.
Yeah. Where? Yeah.
We take one more question from Hari,
yeah.
Dr. Hariharan.
This was about myth. I've always been, again, very interested by the way in which myth it becomes, at one level, very political, and it also offers uh, another dimension, maybe a secular dimension, especially when it transforms itself over a period of time. For example, I was thinking of the cross, for example. It certainly has a mythical dimension to it, but then it could very easily become political, because this is what you erect and this is the way in which you claim, let us say, a land for the king or the queen. And at the same time, it can be transformed over a period of time uh, to perhaps secular intentions. And there perhaps it starts functioning in a very differently political manner. So I don't want to connect it literally to the kind of situation that you were talking about to Goa, but then I was thinking about the larger ways in which one perhaps could understand how myths function today. For example, the way in which the right, for example, in our country would be using myth. Not that they would be secularizing it, but then the political dimension certainly is there, and perhaps from there you try to churn out an ideology, if at all you can churn out one.
Yeah, that's another sort of a complex kind of question, but it's I think sort of central to the reason why I actually have spent this much time teasing out some of the that I talked about. They seem to be very incidental when you read the text, but the fact that I would keep seeing these in text after text, it made me begin to research them, and as I began to research them, I realized there's all this symbolism unfolding. So the interesting part, I think, about all these myths is that it's, I think, useful if we don't begin with the separation of the mythic and the secular, because even the mythic is something that we need to differentiate between something that's, say, a mythopoetic and the which is why I was using terms like politico-theological and or anthropo-legal, right? Because I realized this is actually the way they're working. So when a legal document repeats the story, it's actually forging a kind of community, right? Whereas when the crown chronicler is sort of representing this conquest to the monarch, and he infuses it with these myths that are both from the indigenous territory as well as European myth, there is another political function, that's occurring. And to go back to, say, this question of which many of you have raised about the transition to the British, I think the story of Joseph really tells us one of the ways in which that happens, that you have something that's really from the Genesis, and that keeps getting modernized. But if you look at the range of references to the Joseph story, it's actually from antiquity that administration and tax regimes were legitimized through the figure of Joseph, right? And that extends into into British India. So even the question of the cross, in a way, it's very hard to. So it's like when the indigenous begin to pick it up. And actually, what's of interest to me is that this began because I found these 19th century novels, which had these very sort of complicated symbolism, which I couldn't understand at all, because they certainly were not realist, or parts of the text were realist. Parts of them were drawing on this symbolism, which also wasn't a uniform symbolism. And it's only having done this kind of research that I realized that they had pulled on this discourse, which was sort of available in the 19th century, and that actually had combined all these ways. So we see that even novelistic discourse begins to be informed, by this kind of weave of symbolism.
Myths become myths become possible, I feel, because there is this possibility of reinvention. I think that and only then do myths become possible, and that is why you have the Joseph story, for example, as you point out, recurs again and again, and that's why the story of crucifixion, or even the question of genealogy, that itself is a myth. Genealogy is possible because there is this potential it has of reinvention.
And the interesting thing is, it took say, this element of genealogy is European and this element of genealogy is indigenous, because I suddenly realized that at the same moment in time, there are two traditions for whom genealogy is entirely legitimate and is a way of claiming authority. And that's why I thought, this is an important way to talk about a European power. That this is not something that's just emanating from the indigenous or indigenous belief systems, but it's a sort of political language that is employed at least between the 16th and 18th centuries by both.
Can I supplement a little here?
Yes, please. Yeah.
See, myth steps in, Mr. Hariharan, when all else fails, whether religious or secular, especially in supposing in a place like Assam, we even explain storms through a myth, because where science or philosophy fails. Now, if we go back to the American context, they have a string of myths to explain their genealogy. They recreate things. First, it's history in the brain, then actually action. They have a blueprint for history, then they live according to it. Okay. So myth is the ultimate thing to fall back upon when all else fails, and it doesn't matter whether it is religious or secular. These are stories which help people to connect at all levels. So it has the emotional aspect, the psychological, the historical, intellectual, all kinds of things, sociological, even certain things which are taboo are explained with myth, isn't it? In Indian context, we talk about Bhagwan ka Vardhan hai and all that. When we cannot explain things, we fall upon myths. So they help to connect. So all sections of people and all these, including these European parties, have used myth. It offers a kind of platform.
The thing that is of interest, I think, to say literature students as well as historians is really to look at the limits of narrative, or what are narratives allowed to do from one context to another. So I do think actually that, say, between the 16th and the 18th century, the relationship between a legal document and a chronicle and something written by a priest, there is a particular relationship of truth that doesn't hold if you go to the end of if you go to the 19th century. So I think these forms of writing get politically reconfigured in relation to each other. And I'm not talking about a sort of field of writing that's autonomous entirely from other fields, but even the fact that we find myth across time doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing the same thing. And they are repurposed. You can, in a sense, say that the relationship between science and myth that was established in the 19th century overturned, and say in the US has been overturned for a while now. But certainly myths as they occur are not doing the same thing. In the relationship to science, to rationality, to economy, or the way in which myths challenge each other. So if we're looking at the Parshuram myth in relation to the local village stories, we're looking at a politico-mythic relationship. It's not like it's easy to separate the, I can tell an economic story between those two communities, but it's not easy for me to say, this is a sort of mythic element and this is the truth.
Does it say that Parashuram used an arrow, shot an arrow into the sea, and
Yeah, there are
in,
two
in Kerala the
chapters.
myth is slightly different.
There
He
are
recovered the
two,
land
Right.
using an axe.
an axe. No,
Axe.
it's actually it's the two different chapters of the Sayadri Khand. One of which he uses the axe, and in another he uses the arrow. So the
Right.
thing is, clearly that text seems was written over different periods of time, and different communities have picked up sections of it. So yeah, both the axe and the arrow work.
Mhm. But the interesting thing there is the creation of the Smith, that land was reclaimed.
Yeah.
I mean, the point is this, where you have another kind of a creation myth again, which certainly has, let's say, I don't know, royal connotations. You have somebody who annihilated a number of kings and kingdoms, and then you have the story. Now that is again a fascinating thing of guilt and redemption. Of you feel guilty and then you try to overcome that guilt by doing something. This is a remarkable trope that you have, that gets repeated. I would say in history, you would have it. For example, if you look at Travancore, King Ashoka, after all that guilt and of all that remorse after killing so many people, he turns to Buddhism. The same thing happens with Martanda Varma. He conquers a whole lot of kings and then surrenders everything to Padmanabha and says, "Look, I am your slave or I am your servant."
Yeah,
Which creates another kind of a myth of what it means to be a king, or about authority or power or whatever.
Yeah. What I found of interest when I was because I was looking down the coast is that aside from this sort of narrative where I've linked the occurrence of the Parshuram myth, in each territory that myth has been problematized in relation to a separate group of communities. So I can tell the story if I were researching the Chitpavans versus the Saraswat Brahmins, which is a story
Yes.
that's a Maharashtra Goa story. Or I can tell a Kshatriya Brahmin story because the Parshuram
Right.
story is clearly an anti-Kshatriya sort of.
Correct.
The cluster of communities, and there's a cluster of texts that develops around this Parshuram myth in each. So it's
Right.
like there's both a spatial and a historical kind of tale that could be told around the passage of the legend, or the way in which it sort of symbolizes Brahmin settlements.
Right. Chitpavan Brahmins have a lot to do with the Gokarna dimension, right? Is that how it is?
Yes, and actually, it's just that in the Sayadri Khand, or the way in which there are various versions of the myth, but one of them is about how Parshuram formed these figures from the soil of the cremation ground. And
Right.
so it's etymologically linked to the term Chitpavan. So, and so there are all kinds of analogies about, I think, the donkeys. I forget some part of the donkey. So they obviously, the Chitpavans found this very offensive, and then there'll be an entire string of texts refuting this kind of narrative. So I mean, it sounds comical now, but there was quite a fierce sort of battle that ensued between the two groups of Brahmins.
Do they use the word Parashuram?
Yeah. So
Parashu is actually axe. Parashu is axe.
I see. Okay.
Maybe another name is Bhargavaram.
Yeah.
Bhargavaraman.
Yeah. That's and Bhargava is the other term for it. But the thing is, because this actually literally became the official myth, you have a lot of texts in Goa which begin with the Parshuram myth. So even if they don't name it, they're naming various other elements as the beginning. In the way that people tend to sort of replicate colonial ethnography, where they begin an account of the region with longitude, latitude, and etc. The sort of, it's like this is the first mention of Goa, and it's the Parshuram myth gets generalized as history, which is why it sort of became important to trace this question of origin.
Vinny, are you there?
Yeah. Sir, I'm here. Actually,
Vivek is
Vinny
taking
has,
over.
yes. Vinny has some network issues, so I'm taking over the session. I'm here to deliver the vote of thanks.
Okay.
First of all, thank you so much, ma'am, for making it happen. And let me tell you first, one thing first, that your topic was very unique, and it was actually different from the usual topics that we come across during the seminars and lecture series. And most of the aspects that you touched upon today were actually new to at least some of us. And it also helped us deepen our understanding of settler stories and the history of Goa. We also realized one thing, that we should definitely deepen our knowledge of history also. So it was definitely an insightful lecture. Thank you so much, ma'am. And thank you, Krishnan sir, also for your wonderful response. And I also thank all the people who have participated in this discussion and have contributed to this wonderful session and making it very successful. And finally, I thank all the participants here for making it happen and for your active occupancy. Thank you so much, ma'am, once again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
for the
thank you,
opportunity.
thank you. It was a
Thank you,
wonderful
Dr.
session.
Krishnan. Yeah, it was. Thank you. I wouldn't have had a chance to interact were it not for this. So thank you very much.
Very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vinny.
So, with that, we
Thank
call
you.
it
Thank
today.
you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you.
Vinny is back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Through
I'm
another
so sorry,
window.
ma'am.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry, ma'am. I
Sure.
was not able to connect in between. So sorry, but thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you for your questions. Thanks a lot. Hope to be in touch.
Okay, good night.
Okay, good night.